Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos. Es un gusto para mí estar acá y un honor presentar al señor Thom Browne en la exposición del día de hoy respecto a cambios en la composición de las drogas en América Latina y riesgos de fentanilo. Voy a presentar una breve semblanza del señor Thom Browne, a quien tuve el gusto de conocer y acompañar en algunos viajes que hizo a la Argentina, un viaje de investigación por la Argentina, respecto a buscando nuevas composiciones y adulteración de drogas en las calles. Thom Browne es magíster en la justicia criminal, CEO de la organización internacional Colombo Plan. Es un experto reconocido internacionalmente en los campos de la reducción de la demanda y la justicia penal, habiendo creado sistemas de tratamiento y programas de prevención del uso de sustancias en más de 70 países y academias internacionales de aplicación de la ley en los 5 continentes durante su carrera de 25 en el Departamento de Estado de los Estados Unidos. Anteriormente, en su carrera federal, Thom Browne trabajó en la administración y control de drogas, donde desarrolló estrategias, diseño y programas, y fue autor de informes de investigación e inteligencia que abordaban las epidemias originales de fentanilo, heroína sintética y crack de cocaína en la década de 1980. Terminó su servicio en la DEA como jefe de la sección de inteligencia de América Latina, donde fue autor de la estrategia de cocaína de la administración Reagan. En el INL, la Oficina del Departamento de los Estados Unidos de Narcóticos y de Investigación Legal, Browne también apoyó la formación de la Sociedad Internacional de Profesionales del Uso de Sustancias, ISSUP, la Sociedad Internacional de Medicina de la Adicción, ISAM, las Federaciones de Comunidades Terapéuticas Regionales, AFTC y FLC, y la Red de Prevención de Drogas de las Américas. Y 14 fue finalista de la prestigiosa Service to America por logros profesionales en el gobierno federal. Tras su retiro del instituto en 2015, el secretario de Estado le otorgó un premio a la trayectoria. Su investigación reciente con el director médico del Departamento de Salud y Servicios Humanos y el Colombo Plan ha ayudado a redefinir las epidemias de opiáceos y estimulantes en los Estados Unidos y las epidemias regionales en todo el mundo, descubriendo tendencias emergentes en la formulación de drogas ilícitas que ponen en peligro la salud de los consumidores de sustancias en todo el mundo. Presentamos a Thom.
Okay, thank you, Graciela. Yeah, what I'm going to do is, instead of speaking on synthetic drugs, which are very proliferating, especially in this hemisphere, today I'm going to talk about some traditional drugs, the heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, and how the composition of how those drugs have changed to keep up with the synthetics, such as synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, synthetic cathinones, synthetic cannabinoids, and that. And we started this when I was at U.S. Department of State in 2010. There was, at the same time when synthetic drugs started to proliferate worldwide, cathinones, cannabinoids, fentanyls, the traditional cartels that made cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, to compete with that, they started to cut their drugs differently, make their traditional drugs differently. Back then, cocaine, which is very popular in Latin America, was cut with diluents, and those are substances that are added to drugs to add bulk. They don't have any pharmacological activity. They don't get you high, they don't do anything, they just add into the drug so you could sell more. Adulterants are different. They are pharmacologically active ingredients that complement the effects, and a lot of times they make the drug more potent and they extend the high longer. And this started in 2010, so that the the Mexican cartels making heroin, methamphetamine, the Colombian cartels making cocaine, would compete with the synthetic drugs that make the cocaine, the heroin, the meth more potent. What happened, this didn't lead to death like it did in the US with the synthetic drugs, the fentanyls. You know, what we call this down here in Latin America, I call this a morbidity crisis, or the morbidity perspective, meaning morbidity means long-term chronic health problems, not death, but more or less health problems, damage to bodily organs like kidney and liver, to your heart, blood disorders, bone marrow problems that these different drug combinations will cause. They're not going to kill you overnight. It'll take years, but they're going to put stress on the public health care system, because the user is going to be going in for different problems, not caused by, say, the cocaine or the heroin, which we'll get into in a second. Okay, so when we first started looking, we come down to 2010 in Brazil at first. I got called to a drug treatment conference in Brazil because there was a lot of illness, infections, diseases amongst cocaine users that they hadn't seen before. And there was about 3,000 people at a conference in Sao Paulo. And so what they're talking about, these different infections, diseases that they're seeing with the cocaine users they hadn't seen before. So because of the job I had at the Department of State, was a criminal justice job, we worked with both public health and law enforcement, and we helped build up the Brazil Federal Police, their forensic lab. And I had contacts there, so I went up to Brasilia and asked them to reanalyze cocaine samples to find out what was going on. And what they did, they found out that the cutting agents added to the cocaine had changed. Instead of using sugars that were inert, such as mannitol and lactose, maybe a little bit of caffeine or lidocaine that would give a kick, they started using banned pharmaceuticals or veterinary products that would make the drug more potent and extend the high. And what we did was, since from 2010 to 2017, we were doing drug testing throughout Latin America in different countries to look at the changing composition of traditional heroin, cocaine, and amphetamines. And three of the biggest new cutting agents we started seeing in 2010, both in Latin America and worldwide, were phenacetin, aminopyrine, and levamisole. And I'll get into these in a moment, what they all do to the drug and to public health. And this was in Brazil. These are still the big three seen in mostly cocaine. And then it's the same thing we had looked at the southern cone, which is Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Chile. We found the same thing: phenacetin, levamisole, and aminopyrine, these big three cutting agents. And the same thing, we went to Peru and we tested their coca paste, or the cocaine paste base that they had, and the main cutting agent was phenacetin. And we come to Argentina a few times to conduct drug testing, and with the Paco, or the cocaine paste base, the two main cutting agents were phenacetin and metamizole. And also we'd find some phenacetin and aminopyrine. And we also went to Ecuador. They had a new drug they were calling H, which was a form of heroin that was coming from Colombia. At the time in this hemisphere, Colombia was not only the largest producer of cocaine, but they were the second largest producer of heroin to Mexico. At that time, they were producing 20% of the heroin coming to the United States. And they started cutting the heroin differently. And this heroin in Ecuador and Guayaquil, which was mostly in Guayaquil, it was in Duran, Ecuador, they called H. And we were asked to come down to test to see what was actually in H. It was actually a combination of heroin, cocaine, phenacetin, and diltiazem, which is a high blood pressure medication. And these combinations, this was the basic, there was other combinations in the drug H, but these are the four main combinations there. And some of these were causing overdose death. If it doesn't cause overdose death, it would cause severe health problems. It was also trafficked to the Northeast United States, to Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, in 2016. And where they thought maybe some overdose deaths were due to fentanyl or synthetic opioids, they were finding they're not synthetic drugs, we're finding overdose death due to traditional heroin cut with cocaine, diltiazem, and phenacetin. What they call the synergistic effect, the effect of all these pharmacologically active compounds coming together. Okay, and we went to Honduras, was interesting to do. We tested cocaine hydrochloride, and mostly there was levamisole in there. What was very interesting in Honduras and Guatemala, and the same in South Africa, they were testing cocaine. They thought they had crack cocaine. The users said they had crack cocaine, they were using it, but the drug testing labs did not find any cocaine. And so what happened was we went down there and we tested these drugs. We observed the users on the street, and the drug users were acting like they were smoking crack cocaine, and they were getting a high like crack cocaine. But testing of the combination in Honduras found out that it was a topical anesthetic benzocaine mixed with phenacetin, a banned analgesic. And these two products were mimicking or duplicating crack cocaine to the users in Honduras. In South Africa, it was benzocaine phenacetin. I mean, in Honduras was benzocaine and levamisole. Okay, so very strange, very odd thing. And we've done some studies on these. I'll get into later to find out why does the user think they're using crack cocaine? And you know what I mean? And what are the health effects from it? Let's see here. Okay, so to get into what are these main cutting agents used to boost the drugs or to make drugs, say, more potent in Latin America, levamisole basically is a veterinary dewormer. It's used to deworm horses and deworm cattle. It's #1 deworming agent used worldwide. It's also used as an essential medicine by the World Health Organization in limited circumstances to reduce parasites in children, especially in Afghanistan. We've done a lot of work in Afghanistan. And the thing is, you only use it in limited amounts 2 times a year to get rid of parasites. But a lot of this, basically, it's banned for human use because it was found out it reduces white blood cells. So when you reduce white blood cells, you compromise the immune system and you make the user more susceptible to infections and diseases. And that's what we found out when I went down to Brazil in 2010. Why were all these cocaine users getting sick and seeing infections and diseases that the treatment centers and public health clinics never saw before? The reason was it was cut with an adulterant or a cutting agent that immediately reduced white blood cells and compromised the immune system. What made this worse in recent years was during the COVID pandemic, all right? It made drug users more susceptible to COVID. We saw that in Chicago, Illinois. We did some special testing there. And we found multiple cutting agents that reduce white blood cells. And we saw a difference in Chicago versus the rest of the state in Illinois, where there was more COVID amongst the substance users in Chicago versus the rest of the state because their drugs were cut with multiple cutting agents that immediately deplete white blood cells. So this was especially dangerous or serious when COVID was very rampant. Okay, levamisole, there's other problems that it causes, neurotoxic effects, cognitive and neuroanatomical impairments. Okay, it is, even though it's a veterinary product, in humans, it has some serious chronic health effects. Okay, and what it does was levamisole increases the dopamine receptors in the brain, and it potentiates the euphoria of cocaine. In short, it makes cocaine more powerful. It makes the high higher. The person has a more intense high when you cut levamisole with cocaine. And what it also does is they found out the human body metabolizes levamisole to an amphetamine called the Menorex. So when your cocaine high goes down, the amphetamine high goes up. So when you mix levamisole and cocaine, it only got a very potent product that increases the high, but it lasts longer. So this is basically one of the most popular cocaine cutting agents. And it also, research has shown it's appearing in heroin and fentanyl and synthetic opioids because it also extends the high of opioids like fentanyl and heroin. Very difficult to control because it's an essential medicine on a limited basis to reduce parasites, and it's the #1 veterinary dewormer in the cattle industry worldwide. Phenacetin is a banned analgesic, meaning it was a pain reliever, fear reducer put in aspirin in the 1960s. It was removed because it caused kidney failure, it caused bladder cancer, and it also depleted red blood cells in humans. So phenacetin has been banned worldwide since the 1960s. It's used as a prominent cutting agent in opioids and stimulants like amphetamines and cocaine worldwide. Research has shown We know the health effects it has with the kidney problems, depleting red blood cells, but why drug traffic is cutting drugs with phenacetin. Research shows it's done nothing to heroin or opioids. It does nothing to methamphetamines. However, we got basically some intelligence on this, and finally a breakthrough a few years ago coming down to Argentina, which we're going to get into, when they had the little flywing or the Alita de Mosca problem down here. And we're going to get into that. And because of that, we started to get some information on why it's used to cut drugs, especially it has an effect on cocaine, which I'll get into. We're starting to find out about. Aminopyrine, it's another analgesic. An analgesic used to be an aspirin to reduce pain and fever. It's been banned because it's another substance that reduces white blood cells. So reduce white blood cells, you compromise the immune system, you make the user susceptible to infections and diseases. Another one, very popular in Argentina here, that's been used in cocaine. We've come down to Argentina, Graciela, with Cedrinar a few times, tested drugs. We find metamizole in the drugs, especially in the cocaine. And metamizole is another one of these analgesics that reduces pain and fever and aspirin. But in many countries, it's been banned because, once again, it reduces white blood cells, causing infections and diseases in users. Diltiazem I was talking about, we found that primarily in the new heroin called H in Ecuador. Diltiazem is called a calcium channel blocker, or it's a high blood pressure medication. So it reduces your blood pressure. You combine diltiazem with an opioid like heroin or fentanyl, it's a double depressant effect. It really suppresses your immune system, it sedates you, it compromises your respiratory system, and could lead to overdose. Okay, the problem with H in Ecuador, you mixed it with cocaine and heroin, you have a speedball. That alone could kill you. Then you mixed diltiazem in there, it made it more of a depressant drug to interact with the cocaine. And then you had the phenacetin in there with the cocaine. So basically you had a super speedball, a super stimulant, a super depressant right there that could overdose. You don't need a fentanyl or synthetic drug to overdose with that. So basically, in summary, the adulterant's effect on health, phenacetin, the analgesic that's been banned in aspirin, depletes red blood cells, damages kidneys, and causes bladder cancer. And the big three, the levamisole, the veterinary dewormer, and the two banned analgesics, metamizole and aminopyrine, they deplete white blood cells. And this was very serious when we saw we were doing testing in Chicago 2 years ago during the height of COVID. What we found out is many of the heroin, the cocaine, the fentanyl was all cut with levamisole, metamizole, and aminopyrine, really doing damage to white blood cells and making the substance users had high rates of COVID and severe rates of COVID because it severely compromised the immune system. Okay, and to explain how that works, back in the 1960s, if you took aspirin, we took aspirin for pain, for fever, for arthritis, you didn't take it every day. You took it as needed. But yet that aspirin had phenacetin in it as a pain reliever, and it took years. But after years, people started getting kidney problems, bladder cancer, depleted red blood cells, cutting off oxygen levels going to the brain and that, so it was banned. But it took years to have these chronic effects. We fast forward, till the last few years, and today, where the average person who smokes cocaine, whether it's called crack or Paco or cocaine paste base, they smoke that cocaine 15 to 30 times a day, 7 days a week on a binge, 6 months at a time. So instead of seeing these chronic health problems taking years, you start seeing them developing in a matter of months that these are doing. Now, these don't cause overdose, say like in the US, or synthetic opioids, but they still basically challenge the public health system because you have people going to hospitals when your blood cells are depleted, your white blood cells, you have infections and diseases. You let out, your blood cells go back up, you take the cocaine again, you're back in the hospital. The same with phenacetin. We've seen 18-year-olds that get kidney damage from smoking all that in crack. Sao Paulo, you have 8-year-old, 9, 10, 12-year-old street kids smoking crack cocaine. And what happens? You start seeing among 12, 13-year-olds kidney damage. You normally don't see to someone who's 40 or 50. So has a very devastating health effect. Okay, and what here I'm calling unique stimulants in Latin America we have seen. There's about 3 of them we had tested. I'm not getting to the synthetic cathinones, which are synthetically made, which are equivalents of amphetamines. And we have them, a lot of them down here in Latin America. We're just talking about something just as powerful with traditional cocaine that a drug user, that a drug dealer could do. Like, we'll discuss the pink cocaine or the 2C, okay, which is seen in Latin America, started in Colombia, which is really a synthetic drug called 2CB. In El Salvador, they call it dragonfly cocaine. We'll get into what that is. And then, of course, the new toxic form of cocaine, which we had down here in Argentina, and it spread to Paraguay and Brazil, which was called flywing, Alita damasca. This is more prevalent worldwide than anyone thinks, and I'll get into that in a second. Why? Okay, basically, pink cocaine or 2C started in Colombia. Okay, and this was a testing we did in Honduras. I told you we went down to Honduras to test crack cocaine. They didn't have cocaine. We found benzocaine and levamisole. They also gave us a product. They said this pink, the bag you see there, of pink powder. And they said, it's called pink cocaine, but there's no cocaine in it. And so we tested it and found out it was a synthetic drug called 2CB, which is basically, it's a stimulant and hallucinogenic. It's like if you mixed ecstasy and LSD together, that's the effect you get with 2CB. The thing is, in Colombia, they knew what pink cocaine was, because in Colombia, you had white powder drugs, and 2CB is a white powder. Cocaine's a white powder, MDMA, ecstasy is a white powder. They look alike. So to distinguish 2CB from cocaine, they dyed it, they colored it pink. But they didn't call it 2CB or 2C originally, they called it pink cocaine. So everyone thought they had cocaine, they had 2CB. Now they call it 2C or pink cocaine, and that is known there. I wanted to check something. Oh, yes, like I said, it has the effects like taking LSD and ecstasy together, okay? And the problem we had in the United States was very interesting. I retired to Arizona, and the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, in the Phoenix Field Division in Arizona put out a warning of pink cocaine in the US, especially the state of Arizona. And so what happened was Mexico was taking cocaine they got from Colombia and coloring it pink. But also Colombia was shipping 2C or pink cocaine through Mexico. But it wasn't called 2C or 2CB, it was called pink cocaine. So the Mexican traffickers just coming through Mexico go, oh, they have it colored already for us. So all of a sudden in the United States, we're getting what everybody think is pink cocaine. And we had we had two types of this, okay? But we had in the US, on the left here, you see the bags, that's traditional pink cocaine that the Mexicans dyed. And on the right is basically 2CB, was called pink cocaine. So what the problem was, the users in the US started to thought they had cocaine. Now, the person who will use cocaine in the US, the average dose they will take is 30 to 60 milligrams. They'll snort. But 2CB, basically, it's a lot more potent. So you're only supposed to snort or take 5 to 9 milligrams. But if the user, whether it's in the US, Mexico, or Latin America, thinks that pink cocaine is literally pink cocaine, they're going to snort 60 milligrams, 6-7 times the amount that they should. And that's where you get the severe health effects and the hospitalization from it. Because a person thinks they are using cocaine when they're using a very powerful stimulant, hallucinogenic instead. That's why you're better off if someone sells it as 2C, you know it's 2CB. They start selling it as pink cocaine and using the term pink cocaine, the drug user thinks that they're getting cocaine and they're snorting 6 to 7 times that they really should be taking. And what that does, it puts pressure on the heart. It causes tachycardia, which is rapid heartbeat, hypertension, high blood pressure, and hypothermia, which increases the actual temperature in a user. It puts stress on the heart or the cardiovascular system. You could get heart attacks or severe heart damage from cocaine. Well, you start using something that's 6 or 7 times more potent and you think it's cocaine, then basically you're going to do more cardiovascular damage on that. So what happens is really 2C or 2CB is a synthetic drug. You got to make that like a chemist can make it in the lab, someone can make it in their house. You got to get chemicals and make this together. You got to know how to do it. What if you don't know how to do it? Well, what they did was in El Salvador, and this started to spread to other parts in America, if they didn't know how to make the synthetic 2CB, they found out you just mix 3 different drugs. Get yourself some cocaine, some ecstasy, and ketamine, the veterinary product. And you mix that together, you have the same effect as 2CB, the same potency. So if you can't buy the chemicals or you don't know how to be a chemist and make it in a lab, you can just buy 3 street drugs and mix them together and have the same effect. It's almost like in Honduras getting benzocaine or levamisole if you can't find crack cocaine. Okay, and so it'll have the same effects as 2CB on the cardiovascular system. Now, what I call the new form of cocaine, this is like very interesting breakthrough. For years, we used to have powder cocaine. You would snort cocaine hydrochloride. Then in the 1980s, they started making, well, crack cocaine in the US, okay, where you would convert the cocaine hydrochloride to the cocaine base form. Use baking soda or ammonia, and you create crack. Here in Latin America, we already had crack with cocaine paste base or with coca paste. You could also basically convert the hydrochloride back to crack. Well, the powder, you either snorted it or you injected it. Injected, you get a better high. The base form, the Paco, the crack, you smoke, and it's very addictive, estimated 10 times more powerful than cocaine hydrochloride. But what happens is there's a lot of people, if you want to get a good high from cocaine, people don't want to inject cocaine, fear of needles, fear of HIV/AIDS, or some people don't want to smoke crack to get a big high because they saw all the damage that Paco does and that cocaine smoking can do. What if you had a cocaine hydrochloride you can snort and get just as high as crack cocaine? And that's what happened down here with Little Wing. We had some researchers come down. We went to Tucumán, Rosario, Buenos Aires. We're observing people on the street. And one side of the street, people are smoking Paco or crack, 10, 15 times a day. The other side of the street, they're snorting Alita Damasca or Flywing hydrochloride 15, 30 times a day, something we never saw. So we go, there's something in this hydrochloride. And what it was back near the end of President Obama's term in 2016, he come to Argentina, and President Macri asked him, what's this Flywing? And so we come down, we work with Cedrinar, with the Argentine Provincial Police, Buenos Aires Police, testing Flywing, and all it was cocaine hydrochloride and phenacetin, that analgesic used to be an aspirin that got banned because of kidney damage and reduced red blood cells. Now, phenacetin did nothing. All the research the years showed did nothing to heroin or opioids, did nothing to methamphetamines, but it was doing something to the cocaine. There's no one snorts like we were seeing them snort cocaine hydrochloride 30 times a day. And they were seeing some health problems they were reporting in the hospitals down here. And the way they made this was, it was a very good, you really only needed a powder. Just take cocaine powder and phenacetin powder and that's it. But if you want to sell something new, make it sexy to people. Okay, make something interesting. So what the users did, it was basically, if you take 80% cocaine hydrochloride and 20% phenacetin. So if you have a gram, you take 800 milligrams of cocaine hydrochloride, 20 milligrams of phenacetin. And so you could use that powder, but what they did was they got it in this form over here. It looks like a big rock, right? And so what they did was very unique. They took table salt and car battery acid, and you mix that together, you get a gas. And they put that with this powder, and it would form this rock. But you didn't sell it like this, because this is very, it's very scaly. What they did, you take a razor blade and you start to shave this rock, and you get something that looks like fly wings or fish scales, like that. It looked very sexy. And you put that in little plastic bags and you sell that. And it's, and all you do is you just crush it up and you snort it. And very addictive. People were using this 30 times a day. It was a great marketing skill to package it, instead of looking like powder, make it look very sexy like that, very inviting. And a person can get very high on cocaine without having to inject cocaine hydrochloride or smoke crack cocaine. And we've seen this in this form in Paraguay. Let's see what they had it over here. Let's see, I had over, yeah, in Brazil, it was called scama, or fish scales. In Argentina, alita de mosca, or little fly wing. And in Paraguay or Chile, alita de mariposa, or butterfly wings. And it was sold in that form. Well, in the US and the rest of the world, we're starting to see this, but it's in the powder form. It's the cocaine. Now in the US, a lot of our cocaine was mostly mixed with levamisole, the veterinary product, 80%. Now 80% of our cocaine, and 80% of the cocaine was testing worldwide, also has phenacetin in it. So you get the same effect as flywing, but instead of having to use table salt and carb battery acid and to produce it in that rock form and make it in that scale form and cut it up, you just do it in powder form. But what makes it even more lethal, so what we did was, so after President Obama met with President Macri, we all got together and said, okay, it's phenacetin and cocaine. The next question was, why is it so addictive? And we knew it does nothing, that phenacetin did nothing with heroin or methamphetamine. So we had two research centers, with the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the United States, and asked them, who's the best people you deal with doing animal studies, lab rat studies. They're called in vivo studies. And so they said the Scripps Research Institute in San Diego in the US, and a group in Mexico, the Federal Autonomous University, called a research group called Sinvistav. And so the Colombo Plan, we contracted with them, because NIDA, that's through the drug abuse, had contracted with them to do fentanyl studies. We contracted with them to say, what's phenacetin doing to cocaine? It does nothing with meth. It does nothing with heroin or opioids. And the preliminary, we had a meeting March 21st with the US Department of State, INL in the US, and a bunch of public and private sector experts, and the preliminary results had come in that it appears and it looks like in the preliminary studies that are being done both in Mexico and in San Diego, California, that it potentiates, it makes cocaine more powerful like levamisole, the veterinary dewormer does. There's a reason traffickers are going to use it. We see that it doesn't go away. And so it's got to be more than something that's like a sugar that does nothing like mannitol or lactose. And it appears with cocaine, it does have what we call a synergistic effect. And we're doing more studies on that now. What we were concerned was, in the US, we saw not only cocaine, I told you levamisole, now we see all our cocaine samples have cocaine, levamisole, and phenacetin. So, and then the group in Mexico did some very innovative research. They studied phenacetin and levamisole. What they found out was that phenacetin potentiates levamisole, makes it more powerful. And what they found out was, with the lever and the tail flick test with the rats, they think they got a more powerful, they're using more of this cocaine mixed with levamisole and phenacetin. But they're finding out that phenacetin makes levamisole more powerful, but there's something even worse from that. Remember, phenacetin reduces red blood cells. Levamisole reduces white blood cells. So you're doing severe bone marrow damage called aplastic anemia. You're destroying white and red blood cells at the same time. But they're finding out that the number of white blood cells, when you put phenacetin with the levamisole, it triples. 3 times the amount of white blood cells get depleted. Use levamisole with cocaine alone, so you get 1 blood cell. You put phenacetin, levamisole, cocaine, you get 3 blood cells depleted. So now what we're starting to see in the US, our cocaine is cut with this triple combination, levamisole, phenacetin, cocaine, powder form. But this is very dangerous and very lethal, because it is, you got the phenacetin can cause you kidney problems, deplete red blood cells, you're depleting white blood cells, you're messing up the whole blood cell system in a person, especially the bone marrow, doing severe damage. Just don't keep it away like fentanyl. This causes severe chronic health problems. You're in and out of the hospital for months or for the rest of your life if you're a chronic user. And eventually this will destroy your system, and basically people will die prematurely, but not right now, not right away on that. Okay, now I talk about the mortality perspective, but real quick, Graciela, you're going to talk about the fentanyls. I'll get into it very, very briefly on this. Fentanyl is a highly potent, narcotic analgesic. It's used for surgery. It's also used as a narcotic to treat really chronic, severe pain, okay? It's the most potent opioid available for medical treatment, okay? And so, like fentanyl, the standard things that talk about it's 80 to 100 times more potent than morphine or 50 times more potent than heroin. That's why it causes overdose. But there's more than just fentanyl we're seeing. Most of this is in the United States and Canada. We don't see as much fentanyl or synthetic opioids worldwide. We used to see it in parts of Eastern Europe, Estonia, Latvia, 2007, 2009. But now it's mostly limited to the United States and Canada. But there's more than one fentanyl. There are many derivatives, what they call analogs of fentanyl. And we see in the US, we're starting to see where in 2017, we tested in the US, there was one fentanyl, just fentanyl in a street drug sample. If you test fentanyl samples today in the US, you can find 4 or 5 different fentanyl compounds, very lethal. And so we see a lot of acetyl fentanyl and butyl fentanyl here because it's not as potent as fentanyl, but it's still potent, okay? And what happened is, if you see one of the worst ones we had in the US was carfentanil. We don't see it as much anymore. The simple reason why is carfentanil is 10,000 times more potent than morphine or 100 times stronger than fentanyl itself. It's used to basically immobilize large animals like elephants and rhinoceros and hippopotamus and animals such as that. So you really don't see, you want to kill somebody, we'll get into, right, you use carfentanil, because it's very difficult to cut. We'll get into that in a second. Just to tell you the fentanyl derivatives. I worked at DEA in the 1980s. I did research for them. And I was assigned to the fentanyl. When fentanyl first hit the United States in 82, 83, I was at DEA. I wrote the first special report on that. I did the clandestine we did for state and local police departments in the US. We did lab schools. We make fentanyl. So I know how to make fentanyl. I know how to make fentanyl derivatives. We trained police on this when it first came out, and I testify in federal court, on federal trials. And back then, it was individuals making it. Back then, it was difficult to make, and there were people that had PhDs in organic chemistry. We call them, chemists that just went on the bad side, almost like Breaking Bad, individuals, okay? They were very easy to find because the chemicals used to make fentanyl, you look at who's buying this 4-ANPP, and it was, okay, Dow Pharmaceutical, DuPont okay, they're doing it for medical purposes. And you'd find Joe Schmo, Joe Smith, okay, he's not supposed to be buying it. That's how we took the first 3 or 4 top lab of fentanyl. Were very easy to find, immobilize them, and take them out. What was fascinating, I got to debrief these chemists, sit down with them, and just get into their mind. And they were very brilliant what they had done. And back then, since then, we've had 200 derivatives of fentanyl in the United States. Some very potent, some a little less potent than fentanyl, and there are still 1,400 more, 1,400 that can still be produced. But these were just, so what's the threat of fentanyl? It was very easy. We took them out because there are only individuals doing that. 2009, there was a person in Toluca, Mexico, another clandestine chemist, individual chemist. Mexican authorities took him out. And all of a sudden now, the last 10 years, we've seen fentanyl really go through the roof, really. And why? What's the threat of it? What we used to call, it's like a worst nightmare come through. Back in the 1980s, when I looked at this, it was hard to make. It was individual people were geniuses. They were brilliant chemists. You speak to these guys, they were amazing, right? What they could do. They had tremendous talent, but they'd use it for bad. But they were individual people. Now you have multi-billion-dollar cartels producing fentanyl. You have big pharmaceutical companies in China producing fentanyl. This ain't 1, 2, 3, 4 little people. Now you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar drug trafficking organizations, huge pharmaceutical companies. It's going to be very difficult to stop this time. That's the threat from that. And I won't get into it as much. I don't have the slides here, but it's just not the fentanyls, right? You hear about synthetic opioids. You have heroin in one class. Fentanyl is another class of opioids. In China, they've basically produced 4 more classes of opioids, just as powerful as the fentanyl. Just as powerful, they're all different, they're scheduled differently, so they're not controlled like fentanyl is controlled. They formed another class of opioids we call the nitazines, like metonidazine, etonidazine. Just as potent as fentanyl, new class of opioids, and they've done 3 more. And each of them has 1,000 derivatives. So you're talking about 5,000 potent opioid products anywhere in the world you can deliver anytime these cartels can do. And that's just with opioids. It's the same thing with synthetic cannabinoids, equivalents of cannabis or marijuana. These are very prevalent worldwide in Latin America. Some of them are very potent as the fentanyls. Well, they have their own classes. The Chinese made a class of synthetic cannabinoids called the indoles. And so they got scheduled. The United States went to China, talked about it, so they scheduled the indoles. The Chinese then made a new class of cannabinoids called the indazoles. They got scheduled. Now they made a new class we call the oxyzids. And it's the same as the synthetic opioids. This is not just with cannabinoids, it's with synthetic cathinones, spice and K2, Eutalone. It's the same with synthetic benzodiazepines. Tranquilizer, alprazolam is a common tranquilizer. Well, there are synthetic versions now of tranquilizers called synthetic benzodiazepines. 1-fluoroprazolam. It's lethal at 3 milligrams. Why is that important? Fentanyl is lethal at 2 milligrams. This is lethal at 3 milligrams. So you have a synthetic equivalent of tranquilizer, alprazolam, as potent as fentanyl. And there are hundreds of these. And the same things with synthetic hallucinogenics. There's a synthetic equivalence of LSD, of PCP. It's endless that's going on. And on top of this, some people will take good old traditional heroin and methamphetamine and cocaine and mix it with all stuff we see here, making this very toxic, maybe not lethal to kill right away, but what it will do is it causes severe chronic health problems. Sometimes people, you figure out they're better off dead. They're going to die today or die tomorrow. They're going to suffer a bit. So it's a very toxic mixture of drugs that's going worldwide. I want to get real quick in Argentina here. When we had the forms of fentanyl, pills or powder. Now, this one chart here, it shows you what I wanted to do over here, which I found interesting. One of my colleagues had done this. This is like heroin, morphine, oxycodone, typical opioids. You see how potent they are, and you see how potent fentanyl, just good old plain fentanyl, is compared to heroin, morphine, oxycodone, and all that, codeine and that. Now within the fentanyls and the synthetic opioids, that's fentanyl, and this is carfentanil, how potent it is. Etonidazine, the new nitazine that the Chinese created, you can see it's a lot more potent than fentanyl. All the new synthetic opioids. What's about this? We get into carfentanil. It appeared, about 2 years ago in Argentina here. It was mixed with cocaine. Why did that happen? Well, there were rival street gangs dealing cocaine. And so one I want to take over your drug trafficking network. So I had contacts with Mexico. So I got carfentanil, and I mixed carfentanil with cocaine and sold it in your neighborhood. So if people die, so people won't buy from you, they'll come buy my cocaine. This was a gang war. You don't use carfentanil to cut a drug unless you want to kill somebody. Because to tell you why, is the potency of the fentanyls. On the left, you'll see heroin, okay? This is a lethal dose of heroin. Now, fentanyl, that's too much. They had to put a lot of salt in here so you could see it. But a lethal dose of fentanyl is the equivalent of 6 to 10 grains of salt, okay? Alone, that could kill you. Carfentanil, which appeared down here in Argentina with the cocaine, the lethal dose of carfentanil is 1/10 of a grain of salt. Take a grain of salt, cut it 10 times, and that one little thing that you really can't see, that's lethal. It won't kill an elephant, it'll kill you and me. So if you're going to mix carfentanil with something, you're doing that to kill somebody and take over someone's drug trafficking network or their drug dealing network. just take some carfentanil, put it in the cocaine, sell it in their neighborhood, people aren't going to buy from them no more. That's what happened down here. Fortunately, the health authorities and the police were on top of this. They're able to, they didn't know what happened. People, they saw overdose right away, naloxone, using naloxone. And used naloxone and said, okay, that revived people. Too many people died, but a lot of people were saved because of naloxone. That gave a hint that there's an opioid, and the testing had shown it was carfentanil. So let's say the threat. I don't think, you're not going to see really in Latin America, or rest of the world, let's say a fentanyl threat. There's not opioid use down here really. There's limited opioid use, say in Guayaquil, Duran, Ecuador, Colombia, but it's not a big enough market to do fentanyl. Here you have cannabis, amphetamines, synthetic cathinones, you'll have 2C or 2CB. There's not opioids, okay? So there's no injecting heroin, there's no smoking of opioids. So there's not an opioid using population. So I don't think, I think what you saw in Argentina was a one-time thing to poison someone else's or rival gang's cocaine, okay? Because we simply don't have the opioid problem, the heroin or the opioid use here. Plus, you didn't have, like we had in the US, the addiction to painkillers like oxycodone that was basically prescribed a lot. And a lot of people who never would dream of using heroin or any illicit drug in their life, they were addicted to painkillers. There'd be high school students that play sports or anybody, or people, anyone, me, you, doctor gives us oxycodone, and people got addicted to painkillers and would have a whole new class of people. They're not drug users. They were just addicted to the painkillers the doctors gave them. And what happened was this got limited and banned, and the people had an addiction. They went to heroin. People would never use heroin. Then they went to fentanyl. That's why the fentanyl problem is so big in the United States. People who would never, we had just a certain like 500,000, 600,000 heroin users. That was it. But the pharmaceutical problem with the oxycodone and these opioids, the illicit prescribing of these things, you know, overprescribing of illicit opioids created a whole new addict population people would never use before. And what could fill that void perfectly? They can't get hold of that oxycodone no more, fentanyl. And that's what happens. And so we see all the overdose deaths, you know, from that. But you don't have the prescription drug problem in Latin America. You really don't have the opioid problem. So I don't think you're going to see this fentanyl down here. It'll take a change overnight, turn everybody from cannabis and synthetic cathinones and crack cocaine and cocaine into opioids. I don't think you're going to see that. You won't see that there, fortunately. But the big issue here is it's a morbidity problem, the way the cocaine especially is cut, the health problems that we see. Okay, Graciela. Graciela is going to talk more on fentanyl. Okay. Yes.
¿Hay alguna pregunta que quieren hacer a Thom? Si no, ¿sí?
Gracias. Mi nombre es Augusto Pérez, yo soy de Colombia. Es la primera vez que oigo decir que el 2CB fue una invención colombiana. De hecho, la información que yo tengo es que el 2CB fue creado en los Estados Unidos en 1974.
Yes, it was created by Alexander Shulgin, but pink cocaine, whoops, but selling it as pink cocaine or 2C started in Colombia. And we have that documented. Yes, it was. And we've done the testing and we have seen that. And that's where it all, where the pink cocaine, using it from. It was developed by Alexander Shulgin in 1974. It was used in addition with MDMA and cocaine and a separate drug called 2CB. They dyed it pink and called it pink cocaine. And then it got trafficked throughout the hemisphere. And we've clandestine, we have done with the US Department of State and the Colombo Plan, we've done forensic drug testing lab director meetings. And we've had 27 countries together, including Colombia, and we had 3 forensic drug testing labs from Colombia as part of the global network who presented on the 2CB, pink cocaine 2C phenomena.
¿Alguien más quiere hacer alguna pregunta? Bueno, simplemente yo voy a mencionar algunas experiencias, digamos, en las cuales tuve el honor de participar en relación con los opioides y el fentanilo, no por consumo, afortunadamente, sino por una tarea de investigación. Yo soy investigadora de Cedroner y a través de la CICAD y la OEA nos han encomendado hace aproximadamente 3 años un trabajo de investigación en relación con el tratamiento de pacientes que estaban bajo efectos de opioides, especialmente fentanilo y por consumo relativos a heroínas y otros opioides. En particular, y en relación con lo que estaba exponiendo Thom respecto del fentanilo, digamos, ¿por qué el fentanilo? Siendo que el fentanilo, digamos, fue sintetizado en el año 1960 en los Estados Unidos por Paul Janssen. Yo tuve la oportunidad de trabajar en laboratorios en Janssen Farmacéutica, allá lejos y hace tiempo, y cuando, digamos, se trajo aquí el sublimase en ese entonces, era realmente novedoso. Digo, bueno, porque me tocó trabajar. Yo soy química y bueno, mi trabajo de laboratorio había sido el control de calidad del sublimase, así que lo conozco bien. En los últimos años el fentanilo ha irrumpido en el mercado de drogas ilegales, ¿no? Aprovechando una demanda preexistente de heroína. A veces nos preguntamos por qué el fentanilo. Bueno, había una demanda de heroína en el mercado no satisfecha y entonces empezó a buscar el fentanilo. Bueno, como muy bien lo marcó Thom, es un opioide sintético, 100 veces más potente que la morfina y 50 más que la heroína. Su análogo carfentanilo, que también lo mencionó Thom, estos opioides sintéticos producen un efecto general de analgesia a través de la activación de 3 receptores. Bueno, no vamos a entrar muy específicamente en eso, pero es importante que los conozcamos, mu, kappa y delta, especialmente el receptor mu que se encuentra en el sistema nervioso central y en otros órganos. Sus efectos principales, bueno, son analgesia, euforia, sedación, disminución de la capacidad de concentración, como efectos secundarios, náuseas, vómitos, una sensación de mucho calor en el cuerpo, pero básicamente se destacan por la depresión ventilatoria, principalmente con un efecto directo depresor sobre el centro de ventilación en el sistema nervioso central. Y produce rigidez del músculo esquelético, especialmente de los músculos torácicos y abdominales, y también de las extremidades. Por esta razón, las personas, digamos, fallecen porque no pueden respirar, ¿no? Se les dificulta, se les paraliza la respiración. Nosotros hemos tenido un caso muy desafortunado que ustedes deben recordar, en febrero del año 2002, donde, bueno, empezaban las noticias a, digamos, comentar que había fallecimientos de personas que habían consumido una sustancia que hasta ese momento no se sabía qué era, pero tenía todas las características de ser un opioide, porque en los hospitales en donde se recibieron los pacientes, que afectó a muchos partidos de la provincia del Gran Buenos Aires, entre ellos 3 de febrero, Morón, Ituzaingó, Tigre, o sea, estaba muy diseminado. Y bueno, se empezó, digamos, a conectar los distintos hospitales y todos ellos referían que los pacientes tenían este bloqueo torácico respiratorio, que no podían respirar. Los casos más graves, bueno, obviamente de muerte, algunos fueron recuperados y que respondían muy bien al tratamiento con naloxona, que en un principio, bueno, se empezó a administrar porque, bueno, se dieron cuenta, obviamente, en las guardias de los hospitales que podía tratarse de una intoxicación con alguna sustancia, un cierto efecto de opioide. Bueno, después las investigaciones continuaron, se mandaron a analizar las muestras y resultó ser que era carfentanilo. En principio, bueno, se llamaba la cocaína, el caso de la cocaína envenenada. Muy bien. Bueno, no quiero detenerme mucho más tiempo, pero bueno, hacer un poco de historia y de cuáles fueron los acontecimientos nuestros más importantes en relación con el fentanilo, con este derivado carfentanilo. Bueno, las vías de administración son varias. El fentanilo, digamos, puede administrarse vía intravenosa, sublingual, en parches, y el tratamiento, digamos, médico, el cual está muchas veces designado, es bueno, el caso de anestesia y también para el tratamiento del dolor. En el trabajo que tuve la oportunidad de participar a través de la CEDRONAR, encomendado por la CICAD y la OEA, justamente nosotros visitamos distintos centros de tratamiento en los cuales tuvimos la oportunidad de hacer una investigación en pacientes y en profesionales médicos que utilizaban, digamos, opioides en general para el tratamiento del dolor. Otra fuente, digamos, de consumo son aquellos pacientes que en algún momento han recibido una terapia para el dolor, que después, bueno, continúan administrando la droga aún sin necesidad del uso médico. Otro grupo digamos, de personas, posibles usuarios, que también lo hemos verificado durante el estudio, es en, digamos, usuarios directamente del sistema de salud que por su facilidad al acceso del fentanilo, digamos, tienen tendencia al consumo de esas sustancias. El fentanilo y todos los opioides están en la Argentina fiscalizados a través de ANMAT, o sea, del Ministerio de Salud. Hay una ley que los regula, en donde todos los, digamos, laboratorios tienen que registrarse, obviamente, y todos aquellos que importan, comercializan, fabrican y demás tienen que registrar todos los consumos. También hay una legislación relativa a los precursores de síntesis del fentanilo, porque aquí en la Argentina hay un par de laboratorios que sintetizan fentanilo, y el REMPRE, o sea, el Registro Nacional de Precursores Químicos, también actualmente fiscaliza precursores de síntesis, porque, como muy bien mencionaba Thom, el ingreso no puede ingresar tan libremente fentanilo al país, sino que ingresa a través de precursores químicos, digamos, moléculas químicas que son anteriores en el proceso de síntesis al producto final. Entonces, aquí se hace la última etapa y bueno, y entonces está el mercado ilícito de fentanilo. Pero bueno, los precursores también actualmente están regulados, fiscalizados por el REMPRE, que el REMPRE pertenece al Ministerio de Seguridad de la Nación. Así que bueno, eso era todo, contarle un poco la experiencia, los efectos, las consecuencias que tuvimos, el desgraciado caso. Y bueno, agradezco mucho a todos y especialmente a Thom por haberme invitado a participar.
¿Funciona? Sí, perfecto. Muy bien, muchísimas gracias a Thom y a Graciela. Y ya se termina con esto el primer día de la conferencia, y aquí también las personas que están conectadas virtualmente. Vamos a seguir mañana a las 9 de la mañana. Entonces nos vemos mañana. Buen día, una noche y muchas gracias a todos.